complex topic. It's no longer the stereotypical man who's white, right? We're seeing a lot more same-sex relationships involved in these cases between families, neighbors, different things. So for today, we have Faye Luby, the director of Cumberland County's Violence Intervention Partnership, the Honorable Keith Powers from Maine, from the Court District Court, and our very own Christina Razan at 3L, who's been working knee-deep in PD cases at the court and Wisconsin, right? Okay. So the goal of today, very quick, data, the signs, courts management, and then tying it back into what we can do here as law students or volunteers or what have you. So there's some flyers and some different things that's outside on the counter. Feel free to grab them. Different warning signs. I won't keep you guys too long, but so we'll start with Faye Luby, and she'll talk a bit about
As a graduate of the University of Maine School of Law a number of years ago, I won't tell you just how many, I'm very pleased to be here, also as having served as an adjunct faculty for a number of years. I have been for almost 20 years now working in the domestic violence field, coordinating our coordinated community response to domestic violence in Cumberland County. So, enough about me, because I really want to spend the time that I have there we go. Talking to you about some of the topics that Candace asked me to address today. First of all, data. As the slide says, 1 in 4 American women report being physically or sexually abused by an intimate partner. Actually, last week that changed to the data that just came out from the CDC, that changed to 1 in 3. And the 1 in 4 statistic is now 1 in 4 women report being severely injured by their intimate partners. The other piece, as long as I've been involved in domestic violence work, domestic violence for the past 20 years or so, domestic violence homicides continue to account for approximately 50% of the homicides in Maine every year. Now, Maine's a safe state. Unfortunately, our homes are not. So let's break down some of these numbers, this 50% number. For the past 20 plus years, this is what the numbers look like. This graph includes victims, friends, family members, and bystanders, some of the people that Candace referred to in the beginning. But this chart talks about, records just the intimate partner violence between men and women. And as you can see, it remains, domestic violence remains a gendered crime. So that if you hear me talk about victims as females, what that does is relies on data, both in Maine and nationally, that 85 to 90% of the victims of domestic violence are women. That doesn't mean that the domestic violence advocates understand that males are sometimes victims, and they provide services for male victims of domestic violence, whether it is males in heterosexual relationships or in same-sex relationships. Okay, I'm going to slide that back there quickly, and I'm going to ask you, when you, as lawyers and future lawyers, we spend a lot of time looking at definitions. So, when you think about domestic violence, how do you define it? What comes to your mind? Anybody? Yes.
Household or family members.
Household or family members. So that's part of our legal definition of domestic violence. Anybody? Others? What are household and family members involved in? What happens to them? Oh, come on. Yes.
I just say control.
So control. That's excellent. So it's a pattern crime. It's a crime. It's behavior. A pattern of power and control is part of domestic violence, or as we're now speaking about it, a pattern of coercive control. Anything else? What about more that legal definition? What happens? Yes?
There's abuse.
Abuse, violence. And so those are some of the definitions of domestic violence when we think about domestic violence. What I'm talking about here today is a pattern of coercive behavior. And these slides are out on the table outside, so you'll have copies of them if you want. Pattern of coercive control, of power control, used by a person against a family or household member to gain power control over the other party in a relationship. Now, there's a big difference between the legal definition of domestic violence and the definition that we're looking at here. Our legal system isn't really good at looking at patterns of behavior over time. Our evidence rules are meant to keep some of that information out and so on. So, and we also see when we start talking about some of the behavior, physical violence, sexual assault, emotional violence, psychological intimidation, verbal abuse and threats, some of those are illegal. A good number of them are not. So when we talk about domestic violence, we talk about a wide continuum of behaviors, some of which are illegal, some of which are not. And as Candace said, it occurs in heterosexual relationships, it occurs in same-sex relationships, between married and unmarried partners, former spouses, and between other family and household members. And that gets us back to the legal definition, which includes family and household members. But the difficult part is, for this non-legal definition of domestic violence, is not all the violence that occurs between family and household members is what those of us who work in the domestic violence field call domestic violence, that pattern of coercive control. And the example I'll give you is, you may remember Tiger Woods and his wife Ellen Nordegren. You know, she grabbed a golf club and went after his SUV and went after him. But that fits the legal definition of domestic violence, violence between partners, family and household members. But there was no pattern of power and control there. She had just found out that he was involved with somebody else. She wasn't using these tactics of power control on him. So that just gives you an example of some of the nuances in this definition. And the final piece, you as new lawyers going forward, will see something that we are now seeing in the field, and that is the use of technology is greatly expanding the coercive control possibilities and the abilities to stalk and intimidate and coerce partners of domestic violence, particularly after they're trying to separate. So that's something to be aware of. The legislature, in fact, passed a law in a session that went into effect last week, the unauthorized dissemination or distribution of certain images, i.e. revenge porn. So it's something that's on our minds as we move forward. So there's a lot of myths around domestic violence and what it's caused by. How many of you have experienced some stress over the last week or so? Okay, so a lot of us experience stress, a lot of us experience anger, but that doesn't mean that we're abusers. And one of the most pervasive myths is that alcohol or substance abuse causes domestic violence. I sat through a whole training for mental health providers at one point, and provided some of this information. And at the end, one of the PhD mental health providers stood up and said, "Well, we all know domestic violence is caused by substance abuse, by alcohol, people who drink," and that's a pervasive myth. That alcohol can certainly exacerbate, can make the injuries more serious, but it's like pouring gasoline on a fire. You don't pour the gasoline, the fire's still there. It can make it much worse, but it doesn't cause domestic violence. The other point I want to make here is we hear a lot about anger management in the domestic violence world. And generally, abusers are very good at managing their anger. They don't abuse the law enforcement officer who comes to their door, or the judge in the courtroom, usually, or their neighbors, or their co-workers, or their boss. They are very good at targeting and using and managing their anger against their partners. So that's a myth I just want you to be aware of. So, how many of you have seen the power control wheel before? A lot of you. Okay, this is something that, again, talks about some of those behaviors that aren't illegal. Can somebody give me some examples of what some of these would be? What do they look like? Economic abuse, intimidation, emotional abuse? Anybody can, yes?
Economic abuse, just not allowing your spouse to have a job.
Not allowing your spouse to have a job, exactly. A few years ago, I was involved in a project that would help to educate workplaces about domestic violence in the workplace. And I interviewed a number of women who told me that their partners threw their keys in the woods, put sleeping pills in their coffee in the morning, didn't show up to take care of the kids when they were supposed to, made 400 calls a day to their workplace to make sure that they were there. All of those things can be economic abuse, can affect the partner's ability to have that one piece of their life where they're independent, when they're away from their abusive partner, and give them that financial or economic independence. So that absolutely, that's a great example. How about another example? How about involving the kids? Yes?
I was going to say for isolation, I guess, obviously keeping away from family, friends.
Absolutely. We hear so much about victims that are moved from place to place, and where where the abuser just says, oh, you don't need to talk to that person. I can be everything that you need, and moves that person away from family, friends, isolates. And so they don't have anybody to go to. And I think another thing that's important, if you end up practicing in this area or another area where there are a lot of refugee and immigrants, that's a huge issue. It's linguistic, they're isolated already, there's a lot of barriers for them in seeking help. But if their partner isolates them even further, it's a huge barrier for some people in diverse populations. So some of the other pieces and again, there's a copy of this out in the hallway for you, that we can see are using the children. We hear this over and over again, threats to take the children away. There was one situation, and it was actually when we were working on the project around workplace. A woman, one of our advocates, came to the break room, saw a woman crying. And she said, what's wrong? Well, my husband just called me and said, if I don't go home and take care of the kids right now, I'll be picking them up at the hospital. So, children are used often, threats to take custody, threats to, if you do that, you'll never see them again. So those are some of the pieces that are used. We talked about isolation, using the children, minimizing, denying, and blaming the victims for the abuse, for having provoked them. So those are some of the tactics that we see. But I want to spend a minute, before I go on to the next slide, talking about how some of these tactics can be used against you as professionals, as lawyers, as guardians ad litem. Has anybody ever, been involved in a case with an abuser where they attempted to use some of these tactics on you? Can you imagine how that might happen? Any thoughts? Yes.
Well, just in litigation, having an abuser, one time an abuser made, just constantly used coercion and threats, and also false, complaints to judges.
Absolutely.
Things like that were thrown out immediately. They were completely meritless, but they were definitely aimed at intimidating me and indirectly my client, who was his ex-wife.
Absolutely. Sometimes they can be really in your face. They can be demanding information. They can be using the court system, particularly if they have resources and they know that the victim does not, to continue that pattern of power control. But the other thing that's important to remember, I think, when you're trying to figure out if some of these tactics are being used on you, is that one of the things I learned early in this work is that abusers can be equal parts charm and terror. Sometimes they can be extremely articulate. They can be very persuasive. They can be very manipulative. And it's important when you're working in domestic violence cases to be on the lookout for some of those tactics that you saw that can be used against you, abusers trying to get an attorney or somebody on his or her side, following them, using, discrediting the victim. We hear this a lot. Oh, she's crazy, she's drunk, she's on drugs. We hear that over and over and over again. That these are tactics that you need to be aware of when you're working in these cases. Deflecting responsibility, it wasn't my fault. In fact, it's more common to hear from the victims saying that it was my fault. If only I hadn't done this, sometimes the abusers actually claim victim status as well. So those are some of the things you can look for. So I just want to spend a minute here asking you, so we hear this. When we read about a domestic violence homicide and we read about a domestic violence case, what's the thing that we hear? Well, why didn't she just leave? And we sometimes even hear that in our own head when we're reading an article. Oh, I never would have done that. Why didn't she just leave? So what are some of the risks to a domestic violence victim when she stays in or any victim when they stay in an abusive or violent relationship?
Children.
What can happen?
Children.
The children can be hurt. They're worried that the children can be taken away, can be end up with child protective. What else?
That the abusive behavior will escalate.
It will escalate, that they can be hurt or even killed in an abusive relationship. What about their jobs? They may lose their job if they are hurt or they're not able to go to work. So there's a lot of things that can happen when somebody is in an abusive relationship. Loss of their children, we mentioned these, injury, loss of their jobs, substance abuse maybe, things like that. What happens to these when someone tries to leave an abusive relationship? What happens? Yes?
Just shift everything from outside.
Yeah. It just, those risks stay the same or even get worse. Remember that 50% of the people that I told you, were domestic homicides in the state of Maine? 75% of those people were trying to leave abusive relationships. So it's important to remember that when you hear about domestic violence and think about how difficult it is and the barriers there are for victims to leave abusive relationships. Now, moving along quickly here, because I know we have other people who are going to be speaking, but I do want to make sure that you understand that leaving is a process. If you're working with a client and that you've put just an incredible amount of effort into a protection from abuse or a family law matter that involves domestic violence, and the victim makes the choice to go back to an abusive relationship, it's important to understand that leaving is a process. It can take 7 or 8 or more times, and you will never know what seeds you planted by being supportive and listening and working with victims of domestic violence as they take this journey and as they attempt to leave an abusive relationship, even if they end up going back for economic reasons or because it's safer for them and the children. I was asked to talk about signs of domestic violence. What does a victim look like? Well, victims can be fearful or not afraid. They can be intimidated. They can be hostile. There's all sorts of things but there's no one profile about a victim of domestic violence. Many times, they don't see themselves as victims of domestic violence, so they won't self-identify. So it's important to look for some of those tactics that are on that power control wheel. And it's also important to remember that if what the client tells you is not a coherent story or narrative of what happened to them, that maybe they may have been victims of strangulation or traumatic brain injury along the way. We're finding out that that's happening more and more often. So these are some of the things you can say to survivors. Many times professionals don't ask the question because they're afraid of what's going to happen if the answer is yes. I'm afraid for your safety. I'm afraid for the safety of your children. I'm here for you. You don't deserve this. There are people who can help. One of those people is in the audience here today with us. Kelly, can you stand up? This is Kelly Walsh from Family Crisis Services. She's our Domestic Violence Resource Center, one of our advocates who work here in Cumberland County. These are some of the services, and she'll be happy to answer any questions afterwards. These are some of the services that the Domestic Violence Resource Centers provide. One of the handouts outside in the hall is a map of all those services in the state of Maine and how to contact them. But they provide any services anywhere from 20, we often think of domestic violence shelters, that's all they do. That is not all they do. They all have shelters and transitional housing. They have a fabulous program here in Cumberland County called the Young Adult Abuse Prevention Program, working with teen dating violence. They see thousands of students every year to try and go upstream and deal with domestic violence. And one of the things that's important to remember about these services is that they're free and that they're confidential and that they're great resources, so that when you're working with a client, you can say, one of the things you can say is, let me connect you with my friend Kelly at Family Crisis Services or wherever you are. Get to know the advocates so you can make that warm handoff. Now I just have about 2 more points to make before I turn over here. Actually 3. 3 things I want to make sure you understand. One is, separation is not a vaccination against domestic violence. Domestic violence, if it's really that pattern of power and control, does not end when a relationship, when the party separates. It gets worse. As was said earlier, perpetrators can use litigation, can use you as part of ongoing control and harassment, and can become a tool in the courts. Where we see abusers using the courts and using the legal system to continue to abuse their partners. Finally, I just want you to take a look at some of these. These are, I could spend a whole day talking about this, but these are some of the lethality factors that we have to look for. The real red flags for relationships that can become lethal. This is a study done by Jackie Campbell. On the left side, these are the statistics for 400 people who were killed by their partners, or there was an attempted homicide, attempted femicide. On the right are the control groups. 400 people, 3 years of people who were in abusive relationships. 3 things I want to point out. 1, partner tried to choke or strangle the victim. We know that happens in Maine. We did a study on it. Really be on the lookout for it. Ask the victims if that's happened to them, because 50% of the cases where the victim ended up either dying or there was an attempted homicide, that was involved. Second one, this is Maine, firearms present in the house. 64% of the time, when there was homicide, when there was a femicide, firearms were present in the house versus 16%. Finally, this last point, partner threatened or tried to commit suicide. We have a homicide review panel in Maine that releases a report every 2 years. The most recent report, they looked at all the homicides over the past 2 years that involved domestic violence. 66% of the time, the partner threatened to commit suicide. So keep those red flags in mind. Keep in mind what you can say to victims, and keep in mind that there are resources out there to help you. Thank you.
Now we'll hear from Judge Powell.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Brief words. I'm a South Portland guy, all the way back to Brown School, over by Red's Ice Cream. If you know that. Brown University, graduated here in 1973. My class was the first class to use this building. We thought it was wonderful. I knew that would give a response. I've been a judge since 1998. I worked at Freddie Flaherty for 24 years before that. I was on the committee that hired Professor Riggins. Friendly, personal, did. And I promised Jim Haynes that I would make him look good at 1:15. 3 areas mainly where I run into domestic violence issues. One is family law, one is protection from abuse law, and one is criminal law. Criminal law is obvious. People get charged with DV assaults or terrorizing all the time. The judges get training in the topic. We haven't had one lately, actually, now that I think about it, but there have been several since I've been a judge. So we're dealing initially with bail issues a lot, what kind of controls there should be on the defendant's behaviors after the person is charged. Invariably, almost always the male, as Faye points out. So we have issues like what kind of controls to put in the bail conditions about no contact and things of that type. Usually those are agreed to. Occasionally there might be a dispute about them, but I think it's pretty rare to have a dispute over those kinds of bail conditions. They're pretty normal these days. We're kind of used to doing it, unfortunately. That's a bad thing, but it's become very common. When I first started, I would say there was much less of this kind of case being prosecuted. Now it's very common. So obviously we see the case beyond the bail stage as well. If it goes to trial, we have issues about whether the victim will want to testify, whether he or she is cooperative, whether there's a drop down between from the serious charge that's pending to something else like a simple assault or some other kind of drop down charge that might be appropriate. So not everybody who's charged with DV assault gets convicted, obviously, of DV assault. If there's a conviction, it could be something else. And some people obviously are acquitted. Not everybody's convicted. That's another interesting issue that sort of pervades all of the kinds of cases that I see. This is still a two-way street. Obviously, it's a serious issue. Faye's job is to bring awareness to what is going on and the seriousness of the issue and how you can get help and how to look at it. So we appreciate that kind of input. But still, there's another side to these cases. And as a judge, I can't just sit there and say, you know, this is very serious, how awful. I'm going to fine for the apparent victim all the time. I mean, we don't do that. We often do, and I would say probably most of the time it just turns out that way. But you have to remember, we have a two-way system here. So people are presumed innocent in the criminal law, obviously, and sometimes you have to go to trial and prove what happened. So criminal law is fairly basic, and it's very common to have DV cases there. Family law, also common, unfortunately. We had Judge Gollin, who retired, famously said to somebody once, after hearing what so-and-so had said to the other side, and those are the lips that once said, I love you. Great quote, which I use all the time. Not always domestic violence, but often relates to a domestic violence situation. So people who once loved each other and said nice things to each other and did nice things with each other come to court after years of hassles and struggles and say and do the most awful things. I never realized what people said to each other until I took this job. And I didn't see most of these kinds of people in my law practice. I did insurance defense work and personal injury cases and things like that. I never knew these kinds of things really existed. So the names that are used are the most unbelievable things, and they're used all the time. So when Faye talks about control, we see evidence of that all the time in court. So in family law cases, obviously relates a lot to what happens with the kids. I mean, we have irreconcilable differences, no-fault divorce now. So we don't always get into the nuts and bolts of what happened between these folks unless we need to. So in the old days, you'd hear about the drinking and the this and the that, but then no-fault divorce came along, so that part of the equation often doesn't get brought out in court, unless it's relevant to something else, and usually it's relevant to kid issues. So when we're deciding who has what kind of rights to the children, what parental rights there are, this is when we hear about who did what to whom and who said what to whom, and it's horrible. It makes things worse in some sense, because once you go to court and actually have a trial, you're saying negative things about the other side, and the relationship that was a C- becomes a D- or worse. But it's very common for us to have to hear all the details about the power and control and physical and emotional abuse, etc. that goes on. Again, largely male versus female, but not totally. Then we come to protection from abuse or harassment cases. This is probably the most prevalent area that I get involved. Maine had 5,500 PA protection from abuse cases last year, 2,500 protection from harassment cases. Those could involve some of these issues. Mostly PA cases are those involving people with some kind of close relationship. PH cases less likely, but occasionally they do. So there are a lot of them. There are 1,200 of them just in our court in Portland. So probably a sixth of all the cases in Maine of that type are here. The good news is, when I first started, we had 1,800 of them. So now we only have 1,200. Now, I think that's good news. I think some of that is because there aren't as many harassment cases as there used to be, so it may not relate directly to what I'm talking about. But there are smaller numbers of these over the last several years. People like Kelly, this is just like being in a hearing, because Kelly sits in the hearing and looks at me just like she is. It's really not this close, though. But a lot of these cases come in, obviously somebody comes in who's alleging there was abuse. They seek a temporary order, which means they fill out the paperwork under oath, say what happened was true. They give us some details. Sometimes they give us one sentence. If they use certain magic words, that's all it takes. Sometimes they give us 5 or 10 pages, which is more than I need, but sometimes they do. So we have to assess right there on the written record whether there's an immediate and present danger to somebody that would justify a protection order. I would say in the vast majority of cases, based on my experience, we do grant temporary orders. We don't always, but typically there's something there that would cause us to be seriously concerned about the other side. So we're getting one-sided information when we get that. The defendant obviously isn't there. We don't usually hear from the defendant. On rare occasions, they come at the same time, which makes it very interesting. So we'll talk to one and then talk to the other. And obviously their stories are very different. As part of a temporary order, we can grant a firearms prohibition or dangerous weapons prohibition. That's not true in all states. Some states don't allow you to do it except after a final hearing, but in Maine we can do that and decide the issue again at the time of the final hearing. So it's very common to prevent somebody from having firearms and dangerous weapons. Our system isn't the greatest because basically we check off an order that says you have to do something with your firearms, you give them to the police or give them to a friend, and we never follow up, at least the court doesn't, to see what happened. So we often ask, but I don't run out and go to their barn and see if they took the gun off the hook and gave it to a neighbor and brought it to the East Gish police. That's just not the way it works. So there are some possible issues with firearms that could be used despite what we signed on an order. So then we go to the hearing within a few weeks, usually 2 weeks or so, and either the other side shows up or doesn't. If the other side doesn't, there's often a default order issued as long as there's a basis for the protection order. We don't just grant them automatically, but in the vast majority of cases there's a reason. The orders can go up to 2 years. 1 year for harassments, but 2 years for abuse, which is where most of this occurs. Again, the firearms prohibition can be included in the final order. Often no contact is included in the final order, not to go on somebody's property. Kid issues can be dealt with. So-and-so gets temporary parental rights of the kids, so the other side gets certain types of contact. We can protect pets, which is one that is new. I'm a dog guy, so I think that's fine. Doesn't come up that often in practice, actually, but it is available. So if they don't show up, one side doesn't show up, things go pretty quick. If both sides do show up, we usually ask them to try to work things out. Typically, they can't talk to each other because of a no contact order already, so people like Kelly get involved, or attorneys are there to get involved. I know you folks go to Lewiston, I think, to do some of this work. We have volunteer lawyer people who come to Portland to represent folks who are seeking an order, sometimes privately retained attorneys. So we hope that they'll be able to talk through a third party and try to work something out. If they do, there's no finding made of abuse typically. So I don't get involved, I don't have a hearing, we don't find one way or the other whether somebody's been abused, but the order is just as valid as if we did. If they can't agree, obviously they have a hearing. So it's very common on Fridays in Portland to have several hearings on protection from abuse cases. They all get done that day, they get decided that day. The standard of proof is just preponderance of the evidence, which is a low standard of proof, as you know. And we do one right after the other. Sometimes we have more than one judge doing them to help out. And that's when Kelly sits and watches and tries to help people and work out orders and participate participate in that process. I once asked the Pine Tree lawyer who does most of the cases what percentage of the cases she wins that go to hearing. She told me 98%. I've probably been ruled against her twice within the next month. So it might be 95% now. But the point is, you know, the plaintiff wins the vast majority of the cases that go to trial, not because he or she has to, but usually there's some pretty serious, compelling evidence about what is abuse. Abuse is not defined the same as what you might think of as domestic violence. I mean, these issues about control and background power issues are not specifically in the abuse statute. However, it does often come in as background of what the relationship is and why somebody's there. But just because somebody exerts control over another person wouldn't necessarily get them a protection order. So there are some differences in what we're talking about today and actually the definition of abuse that we deal with. Another thing that's happening more lately is people are coming in to terminate orders that they have received. So they'll come in and get a temporary order, and then they have a hearing set up, and they may not want to show up for whatever reason, as you can imagine. So sometimes they don't come. There's nothing I can do about that. If they don't want to come, the case gets dismissed. Sometimes people come multiple times. Sometimes they don't show multiple times, or sometimes they dismiss multiple times. That probably ties into what you've already heard about how hard it is to make the decision to leave, to get out of the situation, to decide this is finally the time to move on. The other kind of issue that comes up on terminations is after they have an existing order, they come in and want to terminate the existing order. So they've already gotten a final order, and then they decide for whatever reason they don't want it anymore. Again, usually the females saying, I don't want my order anymore. And they'll give us reasons why. Usually he's in counseling. Not very persuasive to me, but could be a good idea. I've heard he's changed. He's not drinking anymore. We need to talk for the kid, about the kids. Those are the kinds of things that people will say. I don't feel unsafe anymore. Now, some of these motions to terminate will be made within weeks of getting the order, the final order. I mean literally 2 or 3 or 4 weeks sometimes. Now, there may be a school of thought, I've been told in the past, that it might be good for the judge to do whatever the person wants in terms of dropping these orders. I've decided in my 17 years that I don't do that. I want to talk to the person individually and see why. I want to look at what the complaint said. I mean, these folks will fill out a complaint under oath and say, so-and-so choked and strangled me, threatened to kill me, did this, did that, horrible stuff. And 3 weeks later, they ran after the final order saying the person's changed or stopped drinking or went to counseling, and they want the order dropped. I often won't do that. I might be the only judge, I don't know. But that's not my approach. I might ask them to amend the order, which is something I've started doing lately. Instead of getting rid of the whole order, why don't you just leave the part that can give you some protection, and maybe you can still have contact or some other kind of protection instead of getting rid of the whole thing. So if the other side does not act as you expect them to act and there's still a problem, then you could still rely on what's left of your order. So that's one tactic that I've used pretty successfully lately. Sometimes I do grant the motion to terminate, but sometimes I don't. So those are the 3 areas where we see protection from abuse, family, and criminal law, where we see these issues most often. And they are incredibly prevalent. I mean, every day that we're doing one of these kinds of cases, you probably see this issue come up. Substance abuse is prevalent, mental health is prevalent, domestic violence is prevalent. Probably the 3 most common issues that we deal with. Thank you.
We'll now hear from Christina Razan on her experience at Williston Court.
Hi everyone. So my name is Chris Razan, and I am a 3L here at Maine School of Law. So I'm happy to be with people who actually graduated. I think that's good luck. And so I just have one thing to say to you all today. I can only remember one thing, and that is, as students, whether you're 1Ls, 2Ls, or 3Ls, you can help victims of domestic violence while you're a student. So I'm going to be rattling through some opportunities for you to do that. Some of them are things that I have done. Some of them are things that I know about that you can participate in. Please, afterwards, I'm going to be talking really quickly. I won't have time for questions. Ask me about it. Ask other student attorneys about it. Ask people who participated in these things about them. And then ask the people in the front row down here and also many people in the back row. And they can talk to you about opportunities. So I think what I'm just going to say is very quickly what my path was to working with issues of domestic violence, and then I'm going to rattle off the opportunities for the rest. Okay, so I started answering phones at the clinic the summer of my 1L year, and the truth is that the first time the phone rang, honest to God, I hung up that phone and I was hooked. So I've been working in different ways with the clinic ever since, and I'll be doing that through this year. A huge number of those calls involve people reporting, reaching out for help with domestic violence. I continued answering phones after that. I then began volunteering with Volunteer Lawyers Project. Volunteer Lawyers Project has a lot of people reaching out to them for assistance with domestic violence problems. You can be answering phones as early as your 1L year. You can be assisting the pro bono attorneys at the Portland domestic violence hearings on Fridays. That is an amazing learning opportunity to sit in that room. I have to say I was incredibly naive about what domestic violence looks like. When I first started attending those hearings, I would look around and I thought that I could guess who the plaintiffs were, who the defendants were. Not even close. So it's very interesting and sad work, I have to say, but you also get to work with wonderful people like Kelly, who are really experts in helping these people. I am a CASA, so I did my CASA training the first summer that I was in law school, and many CASA cases involve people who are the victims or have witnessed domestic violence. And now, as I said, I've been a student attorney at the clinic. For the Cumberland Legal Aid Clinic, so you can start volunteering at the clinic. You can't be a student attorney until the summer between your second and third year. For the Refugee and Human Rights Clinic, which I will talk about in a moment, you can actually start being a student attorney there. And many of those cases involve issues of domestic violence. Okay, so what I'm going to do very quickly is just rattle through some of the opportunities. Please come and ask me about them or ask the people who are supervising persons in these activities. Okay, so as a 1L, as I said, you can begin to volunteer with places like the Volunteer Lawyers Project. After your 1L year, you can be answering the phones over at the clinic, and I think it's even you start the second semester of your first year. And many of those people are reaching out for help with domestic violence issues, and so you will learn what the resources are when you're helping those people. So Volunteer Lawyers Project is another place you can go. Pine Tree Legal Aid, also in Portland. They have students working on externships. There are opportunities to volunteer there. The Refugee and Human Rights Clinic here at our school. Many of those cases, you don't necessarily think about people who are applying for some sort of immigration status to be so deeply involved in domestic violence issues, but those are also often a feature of many of those cases. As I said, the CASA is an opportunity to help children who are often, if not the victims, but witnesses to domestic violence. And the other thing I wanted to say, so not only all of you as students can start helping victims of domestic violence now, as students, which is amazing, you also can do that in a way that is comfortable for you. So when we are representing plaintiffs in Lewiston in the protection from abuse hearings, as the judge was talking about, there are times when we are negotiating face-to-face with the abusers. That's not for everybody. Most of the time it's fine. Some of the time your hair is standing on end on your arms and you're looking for the closest exit. So that is not the way that everybody wants to participate. And so Faye and I were talking in the beginning out in the hallway before we came in. all of us have to do independent rating projects. Yes, and some of us haven't done them yet, and some of us are 3Os that haven't done them yet. And there are opportunities to learn about issues of domestic violence, and not only learn about it, but do writing, do research that is useful to people who are making a difference in domestic violence issues right now. So please think about that. If standing side by side with the abusers and the courts is not what you're thinking about doing, please think of the safety of the library. It's another place that you can help the victims. So Faye said that she's very willing. Here's her contact information to talk to anybody that might be thinking about doing a research project on this topic. And your work, it won't just sit on the shelf somewhere, it will be useful.
So I'd like to invite our panel down, sit down here for questions. But in the meantime, I wanted to thank Professor Smith, Stephen Smith, for helping me with getting Faye Luby here, and Crystal Williams for Judge Powers, and also the Women's Law Association, Samantha Conway, and Dean Abbott's office, Dean Conway's office. I need a scroll, I know. And the Multicultural Law Society for helping with that. And I just wanted to say the reason that drove me to do this topic is in 2014 I lost a coworker to domestic violence. It was July 27th that she died at the hands of her husband, and it was on July 28th on the Metro in DC that I got a Google alert that some woman died at the hands of her husband. And when I finally got out of the Metro to read the article, it was my coworker who I was waiting on the call to have her say, okay, I'm ready to leave. And I just never got that call. And as you heard Faye say, people take a long time to leave situations. And even though her hands were scarred with stab wounds, and she talked about him leaving to have an affair with somebody in South Carolina and then driving to pick him up from South Carolina when he broke up with that person to drive him back to Maryland. I still don't get it. I was thinking about it last night and I'm still tearing up, so it's still fresh, but I hope by doing these type of events, we learn that it's not just our friends that it can happen to, that we keep an eye out in even formal situations that may come up with clients or what have you. So anyway, don't want to dance in the spirit. Does anybody have any questions for our panel?
I do. So we often think about, or at least I do, think about our role as lawyers as being an advocate for justice. And Faye, you talked about how abusers can actually use the legal system to further the abuse in a different forum. So this is actually a question for both you and Judge Powers. Can you talk a little bit more specifically about how that happens and maybe how it shows up in the courtroom, and what are some things that we as budding lawyers can do to be on the lookout for potential clients who may be trying to use the legal system to further abuse?
I'll just briefly say that one recent case comes to mind where there was an abuser, someone who there had been protection from abuse order findings, who continued to bring, and who had a lot of resources, and that was key, and the victim did not, who continued to bring motion after motion after motion in both, particularly in the family law arena, bringing the victim back to court. And what you can do is be on the lookout for this, and of course everyone deserves to have representation. But the other thing that you can do is the attorney who was representing the victim was doing it pro bono, which was really amazing because she had very little resources. We were in contact a lot in terms of trying to support her and to, so that she could continue, so that there was a more equal playing field. And I think that's what some of these efforts are about. I was actually just talking with someone yesterday in Lewiston. There's an effort there, a pilot project there, where attorneys are stepping in to represent the people who may be the subject of the protection orders, which in the long run, may be safer for victims if both parties have attorneys, have that level playing field. So that's another opportunity.
I agree with that. I've tried to talk law firms into representing the other side, so to speak, and never got anywhere. So I do find it a little troubling that we have sort of an unbalanced system in terms of legal representation on Fridays. I think it would be better if both sides had some legal advice. Maybe there'd be more agreements, maybe not, but I think that would be very, very helpful. If anybody really wants to volunteer to represent the alleged abuser in these cases, that's above and beyond the call of duty right now. So I stand by what Faye said. I agree with everything she just said. We do see people coming back a lot, filing post-judgment motions in family cases that may not be all that valid, just creating issues for no good reason.
We have time for one more question.
This isn't a question, this is just one thing I wanted to make sure that the first year students here know is that if you're interested in learning more about the Common Legal Aid Clinic in terms of ways that you can volunteer, much like the ways that Chris has answering the phone, and also about our Protection from Abuse project. We do have an open house for the first year class today at 2:45 over at the clinic, so you're welcome to stop by and learn more about that. Also, we welcome students before they become student attorneys, and if they want to decide whether they want to be student attorneys, to shadow the student attorneys who go to Lewiston District Court to do protection from abuse matters, and that can be really interesting to see how that process works, what students are able to do, the type of impact that they're able to make. So you can learn more about that this afternoon as well.
Well, that's all. Thank you guys.